Good morning, folks. My name is Micah Weinberg, and I'm CEO of California Forward. And welcome to the post-election briefing on new federal partnerships on broadband. We have lots of wonderful speakers here today, lots of wonderful co-sponsors, and I'm just going to tee things up a little bit at the outset and then hand it over to our sponsors and speakers. Next slide, please. Just a quick heads up that this session is being recorded. Everyone will be muted by the host. If you're calling in by phone, please make sure that you're muted. And the way this is going to work is that after we have our presentation, after we have a number of reactors from around California, we're going to be taking questions from the audience. You'll submit these questions through the questions panel, which should be on the right side of your screen, and I will select the questions and I will pose them to the speaker. And if you're having difficulties with the webinar, please use the chat feature. That will message my colleague Lauren Jaglinski, who can help you with any technical difficulties that you are having. Next slide. All right, so California Forward is a group in California. Welcome to those of you from outside of California. We lead a statewide movement to improve the economy and government for everyone. And in that, we act as the backbone for a group called the California Stewardship Network. California is a bunch of different diverse and interesting places, LA, San Francisco, but also the Redwood Coast and the Imperial Valley and Inland Empire. And you'll be hearing from many folks from around the state, many members of our California Stewardship Network. And then we all come together regionally, locally, statewide to the California Economic Summit. This is an event coming up on December 3rd and 4th, but also a year-round process where we work on a variety of different issues, including ensuring that we have broadband for all. Next slide. And for our working group on broadband for all, we have a number of fantastic leads, all of which you will be hearing from today. Trish Kelly at Valley Vision, Eduardo Gonzalez from Fresno, Jason from Chico, and Sunny Wright McPeak from the California Emerging Technology Fund. So again, statewide perspective anchored in the regions, and we're all going to be getting together for this working group on December 3rd at the Economic Summit. Next slide. All right, so to kick things off, I'm going to hand it over to my co-sponsor, Louis Fox. Louis is the president and CEO of the Corporation for Education Network Initiatives in California, CENIC, a nonprofit corporation that represents the common interests of California's education and research communities in achieving robust, high-capacity, next-generation internet communication services. Prior to joining CENIC, Louis served for nearly 3 decades as a faculty member, researcher, and senior administrator at the University of Washington and at Duke University. So, Louis. Seems like we still need to bring you off mute. And Louis will be back in just a second, folks. All right, let's see if we hear you. Not yet. All right. Well, I tell you what, why don't we go on to the Jonathan's presentation, then we'll come right back to you and we'll resolve the technical difficulties. All right, thanks.
Hi, is this working, Micah?
It's working great. Thanks, John. Let me introduce you and then we'll kick off your presentation. So
thank you.
We are really grateful to have Jonathan join us today. John's work focuses on policies to support FCC actions to promote broadband access and deployment, to advance competition, including through antitrust, and to preserve and protect internet openness. John is the former FCC General Counsel and Acting General Counsel from 2013 to 2016, and was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Litigation of the Antitrust Division at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 until 2017. So John, take it away.
Thank you, Micah. And by the way, thank you for putting up the portrait of me on this slide so everyone can have a before and after comparison as we've gone through the last year. And thank you to the California Emerging Technology Fund and California Forward for hosting this event. I appreciate the chance to be present. And especially I want to thank the other sponsors, but especially Sonny McPeak, whose work in this area has been an inspiration to all of us and who was instrumental in pulling together the people for the event today. I'm very appreciative. The people we have today, of course, are experts in building networks, operating networks, thinking about how to ensure more people can use networks, people who are working in communities to connect those communities and their institutions to broadband. What I want to talk about for a few minutes today, though, is about how to have conversations in 2021 with other people, not experts, but people who are going to make decisions about the future of broadband. And I want to talk about how we can make the case that broadband is an essential way for people to participate in our democracy, our society, and our economy. And this is not a stretch. The late Congressman John Lewis described access to the internet as the civil rights issue of the 21st century. Recently, former Governor Jeb Bush wrote and talked about broadband as an imperative, not a luxury. So if we can just go to the next slide, we'll show you that what we're doing today is taking a recent report that came out, Broadband for America Now, and using it as the basis to explain what we think the dialogue needs to be to follow up on the kinds of views that the late Congressman Lewis and former Governor Bush made. But one point before we go on. When we're talking about broadband today, we're talking about fixed broadband, residential broadband. But more than that, I think we should be talking about high performance broadband, right? Broadband that's scalable, broadband that's future-proof, broadband that will meet the increased demands of this year and the next years as broadband usage increases in the wake of the COVID crisis. Our view at Benton is that high performance broadband needs to be available to everyone in America to have a more just, a healthier, a stronger nation. So if we can go to the next slide, what I want to talk about is then who is this audience? If it isn't us, if it isn't the people in this conversation, here's the way I think we should think about it. We know that in this crisis, there's been what we might think of as a broadband breakthrough. People are using broadband as never before, if and when they have access to it. And the fact that so many people don't creates not just a digital divide, but a digital chasm. And we know we face huge societal challenges in this environment. COVID-19 coming back at us so hard right now. The economy, 4 decades of income inequality, the quest for social justice. So the critical question, I think, for us to consider is, why should policymakers, why should a new administration, why should a new Congress, why should people at the state, tribal, and local level who are not broadband experts devote their time and attention to this issue when there are so many other demands on them, when these crises are so large and are so immediate? And the answer I'm going to propose is this, that broadband, a general purpose technology, can supply a critical part of the solution to each one of these problems and more. So if we could go to the next slide. When I was in government, people would come in and talk to me sometimes, and they would say, here's what I need from you. That's not the way I would try to sell you a television or a microwave. And of course, they weren't doing that. They were talking about the public interest. But this next year, when we reach out to governmental officials, to people in communities to talk about the importance of a national broadband agenda, we need to understand their perspectives. We need to understand their goals. We need to understand how they're dealing with these crises. And we need, as anybody who's ever taken an adult fiction course knows, we need to show, not tell. And by that, I mean this. What's happened in California, what's happened around the nation, is that really almost every problem that needs to be solved is being solved somewhere. We need to demonstrate that to policymakers so they understand that all of the solutions, with adequate funding, with adequate support, with a federal government that wants to support leadership at the state, tribal, and local government, will be able to be successful. Now, on the next slide, I want to show you the two covers of our broadband reports. In October 2019, we issued a call for a broadband agenda for the 2020s, and we thought we were being ambitious. We said, well, by the end of this decade, let's make sure high-performance broadband reaches every American. 10 years, and let's do it comprehensively. Not just the question of building a network, but also the questions of a competitive network, of an affordable network, of a network that reaches people who lack digital skills, that reaches community institutions. We said, we'll come back in a year, maybe we'll learn more. We didn't anticipate that the entire world would change. We've all lived it, you don't need me to tell you. Just think of the 55 million K through 12 students and the 14 million college and university students that in the spring of this year found out they had no classrooms, but they needed to keep learning. Or think about the school districts right now that were open and are now closing because a plague is upon the land. We've woken up this year, I believe, to the importance of broadband as a tool in helping our society be more equitable and inclusive. And we need to always remember that although visible gaps appear in broadband networks in rural America, there are almost 3 times as many people without broadband in urban and metro areas than in rural America. And lack of broadband adoption is greater among Black, Hispanic, and lower income households. So the simple way to think about the use of broadband is on the next slide. We are not going back to 2019. We're not going back. And I believe that broadband usage will be higher in the future than it was prior to 2019. And I want to tell you a little bit why that is, but I want to tell you that because I think it's critical as we talk to people about the future of broadband, that they understand that we have made a permanent change, that broadband is going to become embedded in our society in a way it wasn't, and therefore more fundamental to each person's participation in society. So a medical doctor in the 1970s wrote an article in which he said, don't waste a crisis, your patients or your own. We have a terrible time right now. We need to save lives. We need to thank frontline workers. But there are all ways to make something come out of this that could improve the lot of people in America. And I think broadband is one of them. I mean, think about what happened at the beginning of the crisis, just on the next slide. The next slide is showing a photograph of a library in Pennsylvania that had to close in the spring because of COVID, but took the very simple step of keeping on its Wi-Fi system, right? And we saw this all across the land in various ways, but we also saw why it was necessary. There are about 51,000 students in the Detroit Public Schools community district. It's a predominantly Black district. About 90% of them couldn't participate in online learning initially because they didn't have access to internet or technology. And of course, the stories of people in McDonald's parking lots to get Wi-Fi or nearby coffee shops are now legioned, but they're true. So as we look forward, think about another change we saw on the next slide. We want to talk about telehealth. This is an obvious point. People needing access to health services could get some kinds of consultation without being in a patient's office, and were reluctant to go to a doctor's office for fear of it contacting COVID, right? So this is a kind of complicated chart, but I just want to make a couple of points. The black line is from some national telehealth providers. The usage of telehealth goes up really fast in the spring. And in fact, we've heard some study of doctors that whereas only about 20% of them had done telehealth visits prior to COVID, more than half have as of now. Then there's a dotted line that goes down. That's people not going to emergency visits. That's a really important point, right? This is emergency department visits, and they were going down. But there's a third point that I think we should always think about in terms of policy. On March 6th, 2020, the federal government, in an emergency basis, starts paying for telehealth as equivalent to an in-person service. We need to embody that kind of thinking. In other words, broadband usage isn't only affected by the policies that speak of broadband, they are affected by policies that treat services delivered over broadband. Job training, for example. Work. Here's an interesting take on the next slide about work. What can we expect from work in the future? Nick Bloom, an economist at Stanford, looks at it this way. It's the chart. Before COVID-19, about 5% of days were worked from home. In the spring of this year, 40%. His prediction is 20%. In other words, not as high as at the peak, but not as low as before. Telehealth, same thing. Work, same thing. And if we go on, we can go even to a much more traditional sector that is embracing broadband. On the next slide. This is a photograph I took last weekend. It's of a combine in a field that has just harvested corn. You can see on the flatbed truck, the big tool that comes off the front of the combine for corn. There's different ones for different crops, and the combine behind it. What's interesting about this is that I went over and talked to the farmer, a young farmer, who was running the combine, and he pulled out a smartphone at, I want to say, a socially appropriate distance, and showed me the kind of data he was getting from the field he had just harvested. Moisture content of corn, yield of corn, and even where he had run an experiment planting different density plants, how was that comparing? There's not really much that's older than agriculture as part of civilization. Agriculture in all parts of America are being touched by the broadband issues. So on the next slide, I want to just show you how we think about the issues. This is the report, right? It's a 40-page report. We would be honored if people would look at even a part of it. And this is the way it's organized. First, digital equity. The notion that all individuals and communities have the broadband needed for full participation in our society. And that includes making affordable broadband available to low income, unserved, and underserved populations, Black, brown, and rural. It also requires training. It requires affordable broadband to residences. And that, I think, is a new federal effort. It's something that Mignon Clogren and I, the former FCC commissioner, wrote about earlier in the year. Secondly, deployment. Obviously, we need to connect places that aren't connected, but let's make one just point about this. The federal government treats broadband as if it's 25 megs down and 3 megs up. The federal government should not be spending billions of dollars on networks that can qualify with that level of performance. Nor should it be assessing only speed, latency, monthly data caps. This is an issue we talked about before, but what was brought home in this crisis is what we're all doing today. the use of symmetrical video applications, particularly in a household where there's more than one person doing video at the same time, demonstrates the inadequacy of this 3 meg standard. We believe strongly federal funding is necessary. It will have good economic outcomes, but it needs to be focused on scalable, future-proof networks. Competition. Competition is too limited, and I'm a competition guy. That's my background. I don't think it gets enough emphasis. Taking FCC data, and we know the FCC data systematically overstates the presence of broadband, but even taking that, at a typical cable broadband speed of 100 megs down and 10 up, 80% of Americans have either one provider or 2 providers. That's monopoly or duopoly to a competition person, but it's not competition. And there are ways, including open access middle mile networks, that can help that, as well as important steps by municipalities. Finally, community anchor institutions. So just let me tell you a story. I was in the Clinton administration. When Bill Clinton gave a speech that was viewed as visionary, and he said it was time to connect every classroom, every clinic, every library, every hospital in America to the internet. Think about that language. Clinics, classrooms, libraries, hospitals, those are buildings. We were thinking about this as connecting buildings. But if there's anything we've learned this year, it's not about the building, it's about the people, wherever they are. Increasingly not in the building in crisis, and after the crisis, perhaps hybrid education, other online uses will mean that the users are not always physically located in the buildings, and broadband policy has to accommodate that. We also need to look further afield for how different users are involved, and we should look at what the new administration is saying on these grounds. The president-elect had a transition team website that went out up on Sunday, and it listed 4 major priorities: COVID-19, the economy, racial equity, and climate change. If one looks at the campaign statements around those issues, they all involve broadband, racial equity, climate change, economy, the building of new networks, the empowering of individuals, COVID, keeping people safe and healthy. The Biden campaign statements involve every one of those. And so it sets up a world in which this following message can be made. To achieve those goals, the goals of solving those problems, broadband should be employed. And when somebody gets a broadband connection, they can use that one connection to solve all of those problems and more. Think about Congress for a second. We don't know if we're going to have a divided Congress, but here's what we do know. The Senate involves many people from rural states. The House tends to be more representative of urban areas. The broadband agenda that should be embraced, in our view, encompasses both. We need funding for rural America. It should not be left with second-class broadband. We need to pay attention to users everywhere. We need to pay attention to poverty and low-income people because they need the chance to participate. We need them to be empowered to fight against growing income inequality. And who do we need in this battle? Well, the next slide talks about somebody who lives in western part of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Ethan Gliner is on the left. He's the guy who works in an as an IT person in a local store. And he discovered that there were people on a mountain, Benton Mountain in Roanoke County, who had no broadband. And so he created his own broadband provider that takes a signal up the hill and transmits to them. 20 families, the last we heard. It's not going to solve the nation's problem, but we need to embrace non-traditional providers. Ethan's an example. Rural electric co-ops, municipal participation, small local telephone companies, not to the exclusion of the big providers. They should come on in, but so that where the rest of the marketplace isn't providing solutions, we're looking for new ways to close the gaps. And we need to look more, and that's why California is so important. On the next slide, I just want to call out CNEC, and Louis, I know, will be on in a second. He and I have talked about in the past, but obviously CNEC and the California Research and Education Network have done so much to provide connections throughout California to tribal communities in Southern California, for example. The rest of the country looks at California because of the work that has been done here. So let me just finish with one more thought. We know, as you come on the next slide to look at, hopefully take a look at our report, we know that crises bend the arc of history, and that our current health, economic, and social justice challenges will as well. We need to take the long view. We need to see how national emergencies and threats have been and can be the fulcrum for improvement in our communications infrastructure. Here's something I came across in putting together this paper. It's a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in late 1861 when the Civil War was underway. He was the most photographed person of his time, and he talked about photography as a way to demonstrate the humanity of people and challenge a sea of racist stereotypes. He talked about the railroad, and he talked about these technologies, and I want to read you this quote, and the small ticking sound of the telegraph, of alike prophecies of hope. Well, those prophecies have not been fulfilled entirely. There's more work to be done, but I believe we can send the message that it's time to fulfill the prophecy of broadband to improve the lot of all Americans. And I appreciate the chance to present these views to you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Terrific presentation. We already have some fantastic questions, which we will get to after a number of our responders. Really appreciate the leadership of the Benton Institute here, and wanted to acknowledge that we have the executive director of the Benton Institute, Adrienne Furness, who is listening in on this conversation today. She's a veteran in media marketing and was a management executive at Sesame Workshop and Home Vision Entertainment. She's been the executive director of the Benton Institute since 2013. And at that time, her appointment was hailed as the passing of the torch to a new generation of digital champions. She's the granddaughter of the Institute founder, William Benton, and the daughter of the current chairman of the board, William Benton. This being 2020, and everybody participating in different ways, Louis is actually in a blizzard in Montana, hence the challenges in his connecting over the internet, which speaks a little bit to one of the questions that we got from Carl Nettleton, which we'll get to later, about different broadband technologies. He was using satellite broadband. So I'm going to have to play the role of Louis Fox here for a second and give his opening remarks, and then I will turn it over to John Windhausen after that. But I just wanted to say really quickly, terrific presentation. Thank you so much. And I got to come out about something, which is that I'm not actually a broadband person. We do a ton in broadband, but we also do a ton in housing and in equitable economies and in forest management. And we really see at California Forward that broadband is essential to empowering all of these different areas. And that's why we're deeply involved in this issue. So your presentation and your main points could not have been more well taken. All right, so now I'm Louis. Good morning. First, I want to thank California Forward and the California Emerging Technology Fund for inviting CNEC to be a co-sponsor along with the visionary organizations that you will hear from later in the program. CENIC, the organization that I, Louis Fox, represent, is a research and education network with a history that goes back to the early days of the internet. Our partnership with the federal government has been critical to evolving the internet, and our partnership with the private sector to advancing this technology to the broadest populations. In the early 1980s, the National Science Foundation funded national supercomputing centers at several universities in the US, including the San Diego Supercomputing Center at UCSD, inspired by a paper written by Professor Larry Smarr, an astrophysicist at UCSD, who, along with some of the leaders I mentioned above from our California research community, have advanced the internet since the 1980s, extending the NSFNet, which was ultimately privatized in 1995, to private sector partners in the late 1989-1990. To ensure that the research community, whose work is increasingly dependent on this network and networks, a parallel ecology of research networks has evolved over the past 40 years with two intertwined missions: to ensure that our faculty and students can live in the future and advance research across all domains with access to high-performance networks, and to transfer these advances to all of the education and other community anchor institutions. To this end, my network, his network, CENIC, now connects over 12,000 community anchor institutions and over 20 million Californians at K-12 schools, community colleges, universities, hospitals, and other healthcare institutions, public libraries, cultural arts and scientific organizations with public education missions, and government organizations. To accomplish the latter, we work closely with every internet service provider in California for last mile and middle mile connections to this broadband education community. As we continue to build toward a state and nation where everyone has access to high performance networks, the role of the nation's 40+ regional networks and 2 national networks, Internet 2 and the Energy Sciences Network, are critical. Indeed, it's worth remembering that when the residential state-of-the-art was kilobit networks, our research community was experimenting with moving HD and 4K imagery over the network, something that at the time seemed far-fetched, but in an era of Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, and YouTube is now commonplace. We need to continue to pre-position our community for these kinds of advances that impact all areas of life: education, healthcare, and the innovation economy. Indeed, broadband is critical for the ability for all of us to thrive in contemporary society. For California, I would hope that we would aim for the highest performance networks, given our historical role in the internet, the enormous talents that we have in our research community, both university and private sector companies, and the pivotal role that advanced research and education networks play among state and federal governments and the private sector. We have a critical role to play as well as a laboratory for the rest of the country to advance this essential resource, high-performance internet for all. As the great historian of California and my friend Kevin Starr wrote, we have many advantages to work with: a blessed portion of the Pacific Coast, the freedoms and political institutions of the American Republic, a polyglot, diverse, talented, and ambitious population, and a cumulative heritage to a better life. A chance of breaking through, of finding a golden dream by the sea that continues to bring people to these Pacific shores, the hope of a great community. So those were Louis's remarks, and certainly remarks that we try to aspire to here in California, but then in too many ways we have fallen short of, and that has become so clear during this pandemic that has revealed, among other things, the vast, not just digital divide, but digital chasm that exists, and that a certain part of our population has the ability to participate in society fully currently, but many others do not. So we're going to turn it over at this point to our first set of reactors, starting with John Windhausen. So as John gets his camera going, let me introduce him briefly. He's the executive director of the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, the Shelby Coalition. He founded the coalition in 2009 with financial support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Shelby Coalition mission is to support affordable, high-quality broadband for anchor institutions and their surrounding communities. It supports deploying broadband to and through anchor institutions to reach underserved populations who need low-cost internet access. Prior to this, he served for 9 years as a staff attorney on Capitol Hill and helped draft the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Take it away, John.
Well, thank you, Micah. This is John. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to comment on John Sallet's really fabulous report. And I do want to congratulate him and the Benton Institute and California Forward for all the work in putting this together. I want to start with the somewhat obvious point, but it's interesting that it's not so obvious, and congratulate John Sallet again on just the fact that he included a whole chapter on the value of anchor institutions in this broadband report. And while that may seem rather obvious, it's not always followed. It's not always recognized. So I was just looking, for instance, at the State of Oregon broadband report, and they highlight the value of anchor institutions in their second recommendation of that broadband report to the legislator in Oregon, which is wonderful. But when you talk to the FCC about broadband mapping, for instance, the current FCC plans to engage in broadband mapping are restricted to residential and business categories. They don't plan to map the anchor institutions, which is a real shame. And if I could add one note, I took a quick look at the California Broadband Action Plan. I know it's in draft form, but I didn't see any reference to anchor institutions in that document. So hopefully we can include an anchor institution discussion in that work going forward. But the reason why I think that's so important is not just because anchor institutions are who we advocate for, but I think there are 4 different ways that anchor institutions can contribute to helping to solve the digital divide and extending the benefits of broadband. The first category, I'd say John Sallet described very well in his report, and I'll characterize, for lack of a better word, as the direct benefits. So obviously schools benefit from having broadband for educational purposes. Telehealth depends upon a very high capacity, high quality broadband connection for patient care and improving telemedicine. I will say there's increasing evidence of the value of broadband for education, particularly from the report issued by the Quello Center in Michigan recently that found a direct correlation between the use of broadband and SAT scores, and the ability of students to get into college was related to their access to broadband. So telehealth services, we're now finding, especially because of this COVID crisis, that performing telemedicine can provide you high quality care at much less cost and greater efficiency. So it benefits patients and it benefits the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare industry. So those are sort of the direct benefits that continue to grow over time. But there are 3 other kinds of benefits and the reasons why anchor institutions are so important. The second category of benefits, I would say, revolve around digital training, digital literacy training, and digital equity skills. The quintessential example are libraries, who perform enormous public service and just helping people get trained in how to use the computer and how to get an internet connection. Just like you used to go to the library for tax advice, now you go to the library to get broadband advice and technology. And of course, libraries are instrumental in lending hotspots and really are at the cutting edge of distributing this broadband technology and helping to educate people who need that training. But it's not just libraries. A lot of anchor institutions serve that role. Community-based organizations across the country. The one example that I think is really interesting to think about are churches and houses of worship. You know, we had a meeting with Congressman Clyburn's staff a few months ago from South Carolina, who obviously has a lot to say about the future of broadband. And they were really focused on making the churches technology hubs, putting in computers and internet connections, high bandwidth internet connections in the basement of the church buildings to attract young people and help them, educate them about how they can get on the internet, and educate them about the services they can provide, and whether it's gaming or multimedia services, getting them to be able to access this technology and be able to think of themselves as producers and not just consumers of internet bandwidth. So the second category I'd suggest is that digital literacy training. The third benefit of anchor institutions, I would say, revolves around network build out, the deployment part of the equation, where anchor institutions can serve basically as anchor tenants on a network build out. So for instance, a rural area, you may have trouble justifying it economically to build out to these rural markets where the residential homes are very dispersed and not concentrated, and it can be costly. But if you can bring in the anchor institution and serve that school or library, a healthcare provider or church or house of worship or whatever the anchor institution is, it makes the rest of the network more affordable. And particularly if the network serving the anchor institution can be shared. So we know fiber companies, it makes much more economic sense for them to deploy a multi-fiber cable with perhaps 124 fiber strands in a single cable, and they may use 16 or 32 of those fiber strands for the school, but then it can use the remaining fiber strands for other public purposes, including for business and residential traffic. So it makes a lot of economics. It improves the economics of getting broadband deployed to these rural markets if you think about building to the anchor institutions and then to the surrounding community. And that leads to my fourth point, which is related to the third. And John's report talks about this to his great credit. We've articulated this little, not very poetic phrase, but useful phrase of building broadband to and through the anchor institutions. So the whole idea is if you build a high capacity pipe to the anchor institution building and have that open to interconnection, then it allows other technologies to build off of that high capacity link to provide more affordable service to the surrounding residential community, and particularly the low income community. We've seen this happening in Boulder Valley School District in Colorado, where the school district has entered into a public-private partnership with a wireless company to provide free service to low-income consumers around the school via a wireless connection. And the wireless company benefits because they get free access to the rooftops, the rights of way to deploy their antennas. But it's not just that one technology. What's so interesting is that there have been so many rapid developments of wireless service just in the last few years. I was just in the last few days talking to a wireless company that is now deploying wireless service at 60 gigahertz band of spectrum. Usually we're talking about the 2.5 spectrum or the 5.9 or 6 gigahertz spectrum. Now we're talking about 60 gigahertz spectrum that can now be used to extend service from the school or the hospital or the library out to the surrounding community. So that encourages an awful lot of innovation. So not only are you getting the individual low-income consumers served, but you're also creating an environment to encourage the latest and best innovative wireless services that can take advantage of this to and through philosophy. So I'd say for all of those reasons, John Sallet and the Benton's Foundation report is right on target. And I really want to commend them for in particular, emphasizing the urgency. This is not a theoretical academic work. This is a very direct and set of recommendations that are directly responsive to the current environment that we're in. And I really applaud them for doing this work, but I'm also hopeful that California and states across the country take these recommendations very seriously and adopt them and take ownership of them as their own, because I think the country will be much better off as we try to solve this digital divide, which I hope we can do in the next 5 years, not the next 10 years. So with that, I'll stop. I'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And I will now pass it over to Julie Meyer-Wright, our other commenter for this morning. Julie is a senior fellow at the U.S. Council on Competitiveness and co-chairs a working group for their current initiative, the National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers. She's also a senior fellow at the California Council on Science and Technology. And from 1991 to 1997, she served for 6 years as California's first Secretary of Trade and Commerce and chaired the state's Economic Strategy Panel. Currently, she consults in California and Japan on strategic planning, public affairs, and advocacy. Julie.
Thanks very much, Micah. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to talk about how the Benton Report complements the multi-year flagship effort of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness that Micah just described. We're going to issue a report in December to inform the Biden administration's transition efforts and governing agenda. The Council on Competitiveness was founded in 1986 by the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, John Young, to address the threat of competition from Japan and Germany. And in my involvement with the Council over the last 30 years, we find that the competition is everywhere and growing. So the Council's CEOs, university presidents, labor leaders, and directors of our national lab are a powerful, nonpartisan, results-oriented group that is respected by policymakers, and the Council's work has for years informed sound public policy. So I wanted to briefly highlight where broadband fits in the National Commission's efforts and the working group I co-chair, which is called, people from California won't be surprised, Regional Innovation and Inclusive Prosperity. 1% of the more than 3,000 counties in the United States is responsible for a third of our nation's prosperity. The Benton Report offered another metric. Just 25 cities and their environs accounted for more than 2/3 of job growth in the last decade. That's a lot of people left behind. And even in prosperous areas like San Diego, where I live, or Silicon Valley, significant numbers of people, often people of color living in multi-generational households, are left behind. So it's no wonder that our nation rates the highest in income inequality. We should be ashamed. Then came COVID, and COVID-19 and its impact on the economy have put these impacts into stark relief. What my friend Sonny McPeak calls not a digital divide, what John called a digital chasm, but Sonny calls it a digital cliff. And the digital cliff hurts the most vulnerable. We have to address this digital cliff now with facts. And as the Benton Report calls it, our efforts must be future-proof so that what we do is objective and independent of any provider when we measure the quality of service, not only now, but in 2030. We want to assure that no one is left behind. So moving to my working group, economic development, the process, I think, of creating inclusive prosperity takes place in regions, independent of political boundaries. Regions are made up of economic affinities, industry sectors, supporting educational institutions, talent, suppliers, transportation system, and of course, broadband connectivity. In California, we created 12 regions when I chaired the state's economic strategy panel, and they've become a strong network in the California Stewardship Network that shares best practices. In San Diego, we're a binational region, ourselves, a very different region, Imperial County and Northern Baja California. So we're creating a roadmap for regional innovation and inclusive prosperity that we hope will be offered as a toolkit by the Council. Californians won't be surprised that John Melville is intimately involved in this work. The components of the roadmap are discovery, design, drive, deliver. I think it should be led by a region's business leaders to ensure sustainability and potentially private funding, and supported by senior leaders in both government and academic institutions. So the roadmap will first seek to understand its current business sector and then discover the assets, strengths, and weaknesses where the region has a competitive edge or not. Industry champions will step up and join with community partners to design the region's response and commit to specific actions and then drive those actions. Metrics will be agreed to from the outset to ensure accountability and for the benefit of citizens, ensure that the region delivers. So widely implemented, we will build capacity around the country and the potential for a learning network or even a learning academy that will help everyone. So in our working group, we focused on 3 things: the tool, which is the roadmap; the talent, which is recruit, retrain, and redeploy talent to spur inclusive regional innovation, where broadband is essential; and the telecom, which is the national broadband imperative. So roadmap will benefit every region in the country, including those most left behind today, and benefit every single industry. The Benton report said that broadband will create new forms of economic opportunity as well as more companies and more jobs, and we agree. It's not just high-tech, white-collar industries, as you already heard: agriculture to energy to healthcare to local online news, which has been critical in COVID, and all kinds of small Main Street businesses can succeed only with an online presence and the power of technology these days. And their customers will benefit as well, and as was noted, costs can be reduced. In education, 15% of the digital natives we're raising don't have internet and can't learn effectively, especially now. I see great potential to level the playing field for our kids and providing them with quality courses they aren't always getting. After reading in math, my personal bias is for high quality American history and for civics education, for obvious reasons, perhaps done online with notable teachers even after kids return to school, the hybrid learning we were talking about. And as we see kids trying to do homework in parking lots to have internet access at all, we have to focus on what the Benton report calls moving from place to person. We're blessed to have 2 things in California I believe are models for the nation. One is the unique California Emerging Technology Fund, whose CEO is Sonny McPeak, and CETF partners with civic leadership groups to advance the deployment and adoption of broadband in California. Sonny got me here today. I got her into the National Commission work, and she's made invaluable contributions, including talking about California's longtime focus on the triple bottom line of economy, environment, and social equity, and also her call for a federal investment of $100 billion for broadband deployment and adoption, including digital literacy. You heard about Scenic, thanks to Micah Weinberg standing in for Louis Fox. Let me just say that this backbone, a federal government investment, if you think about it, Scenic's a private organization, has paid unparalleled and perhaps really unexpected dividends in connecting not just the research institutions, but 9,000 K-12 schools and a couple hundred libraries, et cetera. It's a great start in moving from place to people. And I could talk about an awful lot more, but let me just conclude by saying that our president-elect ran on a theme: build back better. We can't do that without broadband. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. Amy Tong is going to be joining us in a little bit, but for now, we're going to move on to our first set of questioners. These are the co-sponsors, but we also have a number of really terrific questions in the questions panel. Keep them coming. I'm gonna try to get as many as I can before the end of our time here, and we still have another hour and a half, so going to get to as many of those as we can. But for starters, I'm going to turn it over to Trish Kelly as our first person to introduce her work and ask a question of Jonathan. Trish is the Managing Director for Valley Vision, serving the greater Sacramento Capital Region. They've been working on broadband strategies and issues since 2009, leading the PUC-funded Broadband Consortium to close the digital divide. Equitable broadband connectivity and access is a high priority for their region. It's embedded in their regional prosperity strategy as a foundational enabling technology for education and workforce digital literacy and skills, ag tech and other economic drivers, and sustainable communities, mobility, meeting climate change goals, and inclusive economic development. So Trish.
Thank you very much, Micah. Can you see me and hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you see me?
Not yet.
Okay. Is that right? Does that work? There we go. All right, thank you. Know your technology, I always say. Well, thank you so much to California Forward, CETF, the Benton Foundation, the Benton Institute, our regions, and all our partners, and including, I'd like to thank Julie Meyer-Wright too for her groundbreaking work that she did starting in the 90s with regional economies. That is the foundation that we all work from today. So, Micah, thank you for that introduction. I do want to thank Jonathan for his introductory remarks and just validate his comments about competition, new ways to close the gap, high performance networks and scalable networks, and the 4 areas of the new administration. Those are all things that are critical and vital and important for us. Our region is comprised of 2.5 million residents. We're an urban, rural, suburban region. So the interdependence of all of our communities drives the success of our current and future prospects. And as we've all mentioned, the digital divide is even more apparent. Sunny calls it a digital cliff with COVID. So we're really focused on ways out of this recovery and creating a sustainable and resilient region. So we have focused on partnerships at all levels of government. We've worked closely over the years with the FCC, USDA, EDA, NTIA, and other federal agencies, and they've been very supportive. They've given us a lot of ideas and resources, opportunities for partnerships, but our investments have been extremely limited. So this is really one of the things that we really hope to see going forward is the partnerships around investments. We've talked a lot about the mapping issues and getting that right. So we're eager to expand our partnerships and expand the investment in the regions, and not just in our region, but in California. As Julie and others have mentioned, we're an economic engine for the country. We cannot succeed unless we get the federal investment to meet our needs. And we have so many opportunities here to create the solutions that will help our country succeed and the world be a more sustainable place. There's just a couple areas where we can lead around innovation, transportation, and joint use for broadband and mobility, which will also reduce our vehicle miles traveled. Digital skills was mentioned. The future of work is a huge issue here. We have to give our students and our workers the opportunity to have a viable workforce and an opportunity for mobility while making sure that our companies have the workers they need. And then finally, just mentioning what Julie noted is the regional economies. Ag is a huge sector in our region. We have UC Davis, one of the top global universities, generating technologies that can help us with energy and water efficiency and increasing productivity, meeting the global food challenge. We cannot deploy a lot of these technologies in our own region because 15 minutes from the capital, we don't have internet. So this is our economic case for the ROI to make sure that we have these innovative technologies to create a sustainable and healthy food source. So we're ready to be part of the solution, and our leadership is ready. We're doing things to spur investment, and that is my question, is what else can we do on our end to help spur these federal investments in our regions? So thank you so much, Micah.
Great, thanks, Trish. So John, how would you answer that? This is a federal-state partnership, but it's also a federal-regional partnership. How can the regional partners lean in to make your vision happen?
A couple of points. First of all, I'm going to be very careful answering this question because my wife is from Sacramento and her family is still there. So if I get it wrong, I know I'll be in trouble. I think there's a couple aspects to this. One is the federal government needs to understand the importance of regional and local, and sometimes state-based, but not always, economic strategy, right? The advantage of regional economic strategy of the kind that Trish described is that it takes account of the strengths and needs of an area. If we thought about broadband as just a technology, just a wire or spectrum, that might not seem relevant, but it isn't. It's part of a strategy for economic and social outcomes. And so, just to take an obvious example, there was a study of agriculture done last year that looked at not whether there was broadband in an office that a farmer had, but was it in the field where the farmer was operating the machinery like the combine I showed? Well, that's a use case And if the use case is different, then one has to ask. And by the way, that might be a mobile solution. It could be a satellite solution. There's multiple solutions, but one can't identify the solutions without understanding the nature of demand and usage. So one fundamental point is that the federal government, whether it's through its generalized activities or more specific economic development activities like the grants that one part of the Department of Commerce give out, need to take seriously state and local and regional leadership on economic issues, okay? Here's another example. So ag, right, I'm really interested in, and UC Davis is a leader. It's a national leader in ag issues, just as Trish says. And real life, if you want to monitor water usage, broadband is critical. If you want to understand the efficiency of farming, so-called precision agriculture. So broadband is piece of that, but it's not just that, right? Here's the thing about the American economy. About a third of the jobs in the United States are so-called middle skill jobs. They require some education beyond high school, not necessarily a baccalaureate degree, but about 80% of them require digital skills. Well, you know, the kinds of digital skills I need to be able to access a doctor from home are not likely the same digital skills that somebody needs to take a middle skills job. So it's another place where job training needs to reflect an economy, a regional economy, and the particular kinds of jobs that are being created there, or that we can help be created there. So the first thing is the federal government needs to understand and support localized, regionalized, tribal economic strategies. But the second thing is the federal government needs to hear. It needs to hear, if people agree with me, but if it needs to hear, Trish, what the regional economic strategies are and why broadband is essential to them. Because the weakness of our broadband argument is it's not the biggest crisis in the world. Right. But the strength of it is one connection can solve multiple problems. One connection to one household to reach many. So I think this kind of dialogue is really important, and I'm hopeful that the new administration, the new Congress will take seriously this kind of exchange of views, because I think it's the only way to get the best broadband policy we can.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Trish. Great. And I believe that we have now been joined by Amy Tong. As we get her up on video and audio, hey, Amy, good to see you. Let me just quickly introduce you. We've been talking a lot about state and federal and regional partnership on broadband, and really excited to hear about the work that California is currently doing under the executive order and more broadly on broadband. Many to most to maybe all the folks on the phone know you, Amy, but just quickly, Amy was reappointed as the State Chief Information Officer and the Director of the California Department of Technology by Governor Gavin Newsom. This continues the statewide leadership she's exhibited since her original appointment by Governor Jerry Brown in 2016. In these pivotal roles, Amy advises the governor on the strategic management of the state's technology resources. Her goal is to improve the state's technology performance as an investment in its future. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Amy, and very excited to hear about what the state is doing.
Thank you, Michael. I hope you guys can hear me okay.
We can. All good.
All right. One thing we are learning about remote distant, I've literally probably have 8 different type of a video conference capability, or I'll try to get used to. So yes, I'm so happy to be here, and I guess I'm here as part of the panel, right? And maybe just to share some thoughts on what the administration is doing on the broadband initiative. And so maybe I'll wait for the introduction of others to be done before I jump in.
Actually, at this point, if you just would share about the, we've gotten a chance to get through some of the others. So if you could just share about the state's work on broadband through the executive order, that would be fantastic.
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm hope everybody that in the audience by now have seen that the Governor Newsom actually issued a broadband executive order, and it's the very first, and we were so happy, so excited, and so proud of it. And it's a very comprehensive executive order that asks many of the entities within the administration, as well as our partners such as CPUC, as well as constitutional office such as the Department of Education, to work together to really bring forward not only the work that's necessary to improve connectivity, close the digital divide, through the entire California, but honing in what are the problems, what are the barriers that has been holding us back all these years, and look for opportunities and creative ideas, innovative approach to overcome those barriers. And there was really two main themes of the executive order. One is an action plan, an update to the California Broadband Action Plan that's 10 years old, I think by now, needed to happen by end of the calendar year. And I have the privilege to chair that California Broadband Council, which I do want to thank California Forward for being one of these entities that have been so helpful in getting out the public listening sessions so that we could invite, so many great ideas through these listening sessions to help the California Broadband Council to shape this action plan. Just a plug there, we do have our Broadband Council meeting coming up on the 18th, and is another public opportunity or session for the publics to engage. And there will be a walkthrough of the action plan, as well as continue to receive feedback on the development of such plan. And then on the second work stream, there are many entities, state entities that were specifically named, anywhere from Go Biz in helping, working with Department of Finance to look at all of the various funding opportunities, whether currently tapped, not tapped enough, or simply untapped, that we wanted to have a good account of all of those to see if by pulling all of these resources, grants and funding opportunity, what can be done as a way of funding a lot of these broadband initiatives. There are a lot of infrastructure upgrade projects that are going, that are handled by agencies such as Caltrans or Water Resources, and belong to those agencies, and looking at from this infrastructure improvement work, how do we accelerate the implementation or the groundwork, if you would, for broadband. And then there are, very specific use cases are being applied, such as for, all of the students that are in distant learning, our aging population that would need broadband to help with the healthy aging, and as well as, the home housing development through housing community development department, to look for opportunity to, apply broadband from the very get-go, and as a fundamental utility use, as opposed to a nice to have, and assert those type of thinking up front, so that moving forward, broadband can be treated as a necessity. So that's really combination of lots of actions being called out to be conducted by the administration, as well as the Broadband Council, of developing this holistic plan. We have a very specific milestone and timeline that we're marching towards. So lots of work ahead, but very excited about it.
Great. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and take moderator's privilege, just because something you mentioned, Amy, I'd love to get you to follow up on, because it's one of our questions from Strat Maloma. You mentioned older adults, and so maybe if we could just hear a little bit more about how the broadband needs of older adults and aging are being included in this planning, and how their voices are being added to the conversation.
Yes, happy to do that. And ironically, this conversation already started, prior to the pandemic, but unfortunately, pandemic further, put more visibility the need for broadband for the, aging population. Examples specifically telehealth. It's a huge. I know it's been, out and about for many, many years, but even more visible during the at the time of pandemic, when a lot of seniors and my parents alone are in that population, that the regular doctor visits are no longer as convenient, right? The regular checkup that they need to do is no longer as convenient. So I've seen themselves have to scramble and working with their health provider to get into a some type of a video check-in, but anywhere from having the right connectivity at their house, and they're even privileged to have that. Many don't. And from a digital literacy aspect, how to use that, what do they have the right device that allows them to have to be connected, through this telehealth visit. All of those, just simply watching them, what they have to go through, multiply that by the aging population that many are not as privileged in terms of what they have. It's really highlights the challenge that we're facing. So working in conjunction with the Department of Aging, who is also in response to an executive order of developing a master plan of aging, and definitely incorporate broadband and digital literacy as part of the core focus.
Great. And we've been honored to work with you both in the development of the executive order and then on some of the listening sessions. And you talked about health for the older population. We have a mention from Lori Sanchez about the health consequences of isolation, from being digitally unnoticed, especially for older adults. And maybe I'll just ask one more question, or I'll sort of the rest of Lori Sanchez's question, and then return to some of the other panelists. But youth and young adults are usually the focus when communicating the problem of the digital divide. How is the state of California and executive orders and how it's thinking about this really better characterizing the economic consequences for working age adults in the digital divide?
Yeah, I think one of the things that excuse me, my voice. Oh man, it's getting cold. The weather. Excuse me for that. I think that the bigger way we should look at this is really about equity. When you're looking at, working adults, actually working adults are all, ranging in all ages, especially now, unfortunately, with the economic challenge. We have actually seen much older population are actually returning to workforce in order to, to deal with the current challenge, financial challenge that may have. So looking at from a economic recovery aspect, right? And many of the business are moving to a digital platform. I've heard it from somewhere recently, and I like the phrase that all business is becoming digital business. So having that's our way of our life have becoming, and because of that, you have population that are the haves and have-nots, and that's why it's even more important. Broadband needs to be a fundamental necessity offering, not only for those on the consumer end, but also those that are in the small business that are actually helping to drive the economy, that become their necessity to how to conduct and deliver the services that they provide to their consumers. So it's really a twofold, right? How to better empower those working adults to use more digital means and connectivities and ways to deliver their services, and then the consumer as a way of consume those services that they desire in a digital manner. And I think it's just this is such an ecosystem that I think we are seeing, and more becoming important in the way that without it, you really are being isolated. I think the word that we're used, right? Isolated from the society, isolated from all of the access to services that are necessary for you, and isolated from a health and mental health aspect, which is very, very concerning. So I do see, because of that, very much appreciate the fact that people are more and more looking at broadband as a necessity rather than nice to have.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Happy to have you stick around as long as you can. We're going to move back to some of our regional commenters, moving next to Eduardo Gonzalez. So Eduardo, will you get up on video and audio? I will introduce you to our audience. Eduardo is the Interim Executive Director of the Office of Community and Economic Development at California State University, Fresno, so just down the road from Sacramento. In his role, he oversees the San Joaquin Valley Regional Broadband Consortium and Fresno State Connect, an initiative that helps close the digital divide in the Central Valley. Eduardo's passion is working with public-private partnerships and creating innovative solutions to digital equity and implementing digital inclusion in rural and underserved communities in the San Joaquin Valley. So interested in your comments and any question that you have for Jonathan and the other folks.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me, Micah?
Absolutely, good to go.
So thank you, California Forward and CETF for allowing us to co-sponsor this event. At Fresno State, we're committed to developing and scaling a systemic approach to digital equity that includes public-private partnerships at the national, state, and local level. So broadband is a tool for the future, and we all know that. And if implemented with an equitable lens, it can help rebuild, shape economies, educational systems, workforce, ag tech, entertainment, business, telehealth, emergency response, etc. We all know the importance of broadband. But most important, broadband is a tool that will help low-income, moderate-income children and their families climb out of their intergenerational poverty through systemic approaches that equip them with the online resources they need to build wealth and shape their future. John talked a little bit about learning what communities need to find solutions to digital equity. What we know is that communities need solutions for digital equity that involve federal, state, public-private partnerships to close the digital divide, specifically to low-income neighborhoods, rural communities across the nation. For years, broadband has been a top-bottom strategy solution and very little bottom-up solutions until the pandemic began. Let's remember that we need to ensure that not only we need to include rural communities, tribal lands, and low-income neighborhoods in our urban centers. We have two main questions. What are the infrastructure investment needs and gaps in getting communities online? What does the federal state agencies need to help build communities that are connected to resources available to urban, resources available that our urban counterparts currently are privileged to? The second question is, how can we be more inclusive where everyone has a voice at the table to help build the networks that we need to achieve our goals and dreams? And I know that Amy talked a little bit about that, but how can we be more inclusive for rural communities and tribal lands?
Any specific questions for John, Eduardo?
So those were the specific questions. Is John, how can we be more inclusive and bringing everyone to the table to have one voice? And then the first one was, what infrastructure investment need to happen at the federal and state level to make this a reality?
Great.
I'm going to take them in reverse order, if that's okay, Eduardo. Congressman Clyburn, Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, introduced a pretty comprehensive bill this year. It passed the House of Representatives as part of a big infrastructure package. It was not taken up by the Senate. Time ran out. It allocates about $80 billion to deployment of networks and billions more to affordability and grants to the states, money that the states can give out in grants for digital equity. It's a good starting point. I mentioned in my remark, former Governor Bush put out a proposal of $100 billion recently. That's probably a reasonable range, right? So it's a lot of money, and state and local economies and tribal economies are pressed right now. So the first thing is, I think America needs to understand this is a moment for short-term benefits and long-term investments. And the federal government needs to step up to the plate and provide that kind of funding to achieve all of the goals, not just building networks, and not just building networks in some places, but goals that reach the 4 building blocks that I discussed, including digital equity. I also think, although I don't pretend to be an expert on this, that there's a particular emphasis that's needed on tribal lands. In our report, we present recommendations made by Tracy Morris from Arizona State University and Jeff Blackwell, with whom I worked at the FCC, about particular efforts for tribal lands, including an infrastructure fund and special treatment of spectrum that's available in Indian country. The federal government needs a comprehensive approach. So that's the first thing. It has to provide funding. The problem with broadband issues sometimes is they're treated as if they were just engineering questions that can be dealt with just from DC. But they're not. They're about the shaping of society. And that's my second point, which I've already made. The federal government needs to adopt the view of including and supporting state, tribal, and local leadership. And then the third piece is, as you're doing right now, is these voices need to be heard by the policymakers. Here's one way to think about it. Everything we're talking about for the future of broadband, issues that Amy talked about, are about the nature of demand going forward, what people need. So let's not start talking about whether it's fiber or not. Let's talk about what people need to participate in society. I think that's the fundamental message, and I think it needs to come from people and organizations like you and like the people and organizations in this meeting today who don't, it's not about the arcana of rights of way, although they can be of enormous practical importance. It's about what people need. What does a family need to have its kids educated, to be able to work? What does a worker need to get a new job? What do we need to advance economic opportunity, healthcare? That's the message that I think hasn't been made as strongly in the past. But with this COVID experience, now people will understand. It's the message you sent today, and it's a very strong one.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Eduardo. Thanks, John. And now we're making our way down the state of California. We were in Sacramento and then in Fresno, and now on audio, but not video, Martha Van Royen. She is a digital inclusion champion who's the manager of the Inland Empire Regional Broadband Consortium. Martha.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah, the Inland Empire Broadband Consortium, for those who don't know, covers San Bernardino and Riverside County. Both of these counties are very large, with San Bernardino County being known as the largest county in the country. And we cover a vast area of urban, suburban, rural, mountains, and desert. We have tribal land, and we are diverse, and we have many disadvantaged communities. So in that context, we have found that one of our biggest issues is we have issues with, I don't want to talk about the things that my colleagues have talked about. I wanted to build off of that and address the infrastructure side of broadband deployment. And we have many areas that have no service or a dial-up level service where you can make that little crunchy sound, in your phone line that you had many years ago. That's about the level of service that many places that are very scattered or in geographic areas that are difficult to get to, that have very bad service. But interestingly enough, we have very bad service right in our urban core, where there's been a disinvestment within our downtowns, especially areas like the city of San Bernardino. I literally just talked to a church that provides daycare. It is open during COVID. It has been open. They have 40 to 50 children in a low-income neighborhood that utilize the daycare. They have X amount of teachers, and they're only internet that they have available at the daycare is under 5 megabits per second down through AT&T. So they're using like a legacy system, and they have very low service. So what they've had to do during COVID is they've had to actually ask these parents who are already low income to buy their own, because this is a nonprofit daycare that's run under the auspices of the oldest church in Highland, California. Okay, so this is bootstrapping all the way. So they've had to ask the parents to buy their own hotspots and bring them to the daycare with them so that the kids can do the activities that are now online. So in doing that, that's a very difficult problem, because right across from this daycare is a Stater Brothers Market, a big grocery store, plenty of residents. So where's the service at? The whole area, like the grocery store, they're paying for their own service through a dedicated enterprise system. The residents are all kind of suffering with one server. That's it. Then to make this just a little more juicy, the church years ago actually gave T-Mobile a lease for a tower on their property, and then they needed some money for the church, so they ended up like having a one-time stipend. So we don't even have service from T-Mobile, even though the tower is like actually on the property. So our consortium's working on trying to work through that kind of issue. So I give you that as some background, as I could give you a story about, being in the desert and one block is served and the next block isn't. So we have been, one thing in your report, that in Johnson's report from the Benton Institute, that really challenged us and made us think that we need to start championing this issue, is we have been told by providers, especially the legacy providers, the incumbents, that anytime we want to go for a grant or we want to put in for additional support, anything we try to do to improve the community development of broadband, we're told, our leaders and legislators are told, well, that would be overbuild, because there might be one system that's poorly operated or can't be upgraded or isn't being upgraded. But we're actually told it's served and that would be overbuild. You don't want to spend extra money in an area that already has service. You want to go to areas that have no service at all and really help the people that need help. So the people I just described really need help, but on the California broadband map, they actually are showed as served. It does not say that it's under 5 service. The AT&T site says it, but the map that the state has through the PUC shows it as over 6. So there's some disconnect in data and so on and so forth. So what we picked up in your report is that we need to foster and advocate for more competition and for more consumer input into the services that they need. So we were very appreciative of you addressing the overbuild problem, because it transcends our entire region. And so the other point I wanted to make, and I have a question after I make another point, is our consortium has found after 8 years that we think the private sector can provide service to us if they see us as a worthy candidate to pay for their service. Oftentimes they're misunderstanding our demographics, or we have to wait for the census to update to show that there's neighborhoods that are actually have enough funding to be worthy of an investment. And we also have to compete heavily with other areas that are known as only rural when we're looking for grant money. So we have thought that government, and we have been working diligently to get government to play a role that is not to replace service, or maybe to strategically do internet for economic development or as last mile. But we have really worked on leveraging, trying to get the word out to leverage public assets such as road right-of-way, any infrastructure space, any public space that's owned by the public, to have those opportunities be provided to broadband providers. We would also like to see entrepreneurial and innovative broadband providers be embraced by the community instead of leery and concerned that, you know, if it doesn't have a brand name on it, they don't know who they're dealing with. There's a lot of some of our best service in our region is coming from what I call entrepreneurial, you know, bust up the old model and put something else in. And we have some gigabit service in areas where it would surprise the people on the call. So we don't want to be locked in by overbuild mentality that says you only get one service, one bad service, or two bad services. We'd like to see ways to streamline the system so we can have more competition and more opportunities and more choices for our people who live here that need the service so bad for all the things we've talked about. So we've talked about leveraging public assets. We've talked about, it's really important, streamlining and lowering the time and cost of permitting for broadband. I have examples of over 5 to 7 years while someone is trying, a broadband provider, incumbent, legacy, or entrepreneurial, is trying to get through the web of local agencies, regional agencies, state agencies, and federal agencies. And on top of it, that's not even CEQA. That's just their permitting for encroachment permits or right-of-way access or access to some space that they need. So the question that we have is that we have been struggling to get the attention of the local to the top engineers in our state and at our local level. Everyone tells us, well, that's someone else's job. We don't do broadband. We're not telecommunication engineers. We're civil engineers. We don't get involved in that unless we want some extra conduit for our own ITS system for our traffic controls. So I would think that building off of the report, that there could be a way that we could get broadband into the engineering field at the university level. There's a lot of documentation and academic research on internet benefiting vehicle miles traveled reduction and greenhouse gas reduction, but it never gets into policy at the state, federal, or local level. We don't see policies that say we ought to telecommute, it's good for the environment. We ought to telehealth and it should be paid for by the insurance. It's good for the environment. It's good for the community. We ought to think about some distance learning, especially at community college, where you might have a class in the morning at 9 o'clock and a class at 7 p.m. and work at Starbucks and Kohl's, 2 jobs during the day. That's a lot of trips just to do a couple of things to get your life organized. So we think that the university level, where the professors start talking about implementing broadband planning in environmental rules such as CEQA, in land planning, in engineering standards. We think the American Society of Civil Engineers and the American Public Works Association and all of the transportation professional organizations should start taking broadband as one of their issues and not something that, oh, that's telecom. We don't get involved in that. So, you know, my question for Jonathan is, we're just a small area, even though we're a big region, we're small town people. And we work really hard from the bottom to the top at the state. And it's been about, I'd say, 5 years of talking about this. Do you see a way with your academic and your national policy influence of getting this into the university academia and moving it into professional development of engineers and land planners and community developers and environmental professionals, and then moving it into federal, state, and local actual policy where people say a simple question, hey, you're building some new houses. What's your level of service for broadband? Have you thought about that? Because it's not on any planner's checklist and it's not asked. They say if there's a telephone, you're served. We move on to other issues like electricity, water, sewer, and those, you know, traditional regulated utilities. So that's our question: is how do we make headway when we feel like we're the only ones talking about this? There's so many things to talk about, that this issue of getting it into the actual psyche of all of these different groups that all play a part in broadband deployment they're pretty much saying, well, that's the work of other people. You know, keep us abreast, but we're not making any changes to our policy. COVID has been the only thing, which is disgusting to me that it had to be COVID, but COVID is the only thing that I see, you know, making some changes in policy by necessity. So I hope my question's clear is how do we get it into the engineering field, the planning field, the urban planning field, and all the professionals, and then all of the regulators and officials that have a role to play. Thank you.
Yes, of course. No, thank you, Martha. It's a wonderful idea. I hadn't thought about it, even heard of before, about getting it into the professional disciplines. So let me come back to that, because you also talked about policy and you also talked about overbuilding. So I think we only have an hour left. That would be not enough time for me to give you my actual views about the overbuilding debate, but I'll do it fast, because my actual, you know, I'm actually an antitrust lawyer, right? So when I hear the word overbuilding, I think, why aren't people talking about competition? What is overbuilding? Overbuilding is a label. It's not a form of analysis. If I have one supermarket, it doesn't mean that a second supermarket is overbuilding. Maybe there aren't enough customers for two supermarkets. That could be true, but that's a competition question. We ought to be asking about broadband from a competition point of view. Are consumers getting the benefit of competition? Are they getting better prices? Are they getting better quality? Are they getting faster innovation? Typically, in a monopoly market, we think they're not. People aren't, right? So whether it's overbuilding or something else, the question isn't about the incumbent company only. It's about our consumers going to be better off. And by the way, given the essential nature of broadband, if there are higher prices than a competitive market would yield, that's acting as a disproportionate punishment for lower income people, the kind of people you talked about buying hut spots for the neighborhood facility. And one other thing about overbuilding, the question comes up in terms of federal funding. I don't know of anybody who says whether there's a 1 gigabit network, 1 gigabit symmetrical fiber network, the federal government should be spending money to build a second network there. I've never heard that. But that's not the way the issue is coming up. And it's not the way you explained it. It's coming up in the world where people are getting 5 megs or 10 megs or 15 megs, not even the level of service that the Federal Communications Commission thinks is broadband, or getting service that meets that minimum criteria but isn't good enough. Now, the federal government is just running an auction of $16 billion. It is an overbuild auction, really, because the federal government gave money to networks to build 4 meg down, 1 meg up networks, and now is giving more people money to build them in the same place. That's not a good use of federal funds in the long term. Federal funding should be going to future-proof scalable networks. Okay, I'm sorry, that's my overbuilding rant. But there's work to be done, and it's work to be done by these kinds of groups and all of us. We need to break through to people who don't do broadband. That's been my essential point. We need to get them to understand that they benefit, that their policies are built in part on broadband. So, for example, one of the recommendations we make at the federal level is that where there's going to be federal infrastructure built, a road, there ought to be fiber laid that's available to use as part of the construction of the road, or in federal housing, or standards for federal housing. So I think it's an advocacy job. I'm sorry, I don't have a simpler message than that. But I think we need to pull together all the use cases, all the future of broadband that we can understand, and we need to go to people and say, this is partly your problem, not just ours. But then I think there's a whole nother issue, and I love the fact that you've raised this. around bringing this into professional education. And I don't, I haven't thought about it before, but you're right. If people who are planners think of broadband as part of city planning, then that starts to bring it up from the ground up. And I think we should do that. And I think we ought to look for partners in such institutions who could become advocates of that approach. I think it's a wonderful idea.
Great, thanks, John. And now we'll wrap up here with Jason Schwenkler from CSU Chico, jumping back up to Northern California. Jason was introduced to the topic of broadband by carrying out CETF's aggregate demand studies in 2009, from which our consortia were born. He provided mapping support to many of the consortia across the state, as well as support to the CPUC statewide broadband mapping efforts, while finally taking fiscal lead of upstate and northeastern consortia around 2015. Now, Jason's executive director of the North State Planning and Development Collective, which includes the Geographical Information Center, Center for Economic Development, and these two consortia. He helps bridge the gap for so many disciplines who convene on the need for fast, reliable broadband in a vast, sparsely populated portion of our state. So Jason, a couple of minutes from you, and then a question for John, and then we'll get to the number of the questions in the queue.
Thank you, Micah. And I'll try to be quick so we can get to Q&A. So our consortia is approximately the size of the state of South Carolina, which is the 39th largest state, with the population of North Dakota, which is the third less populated state. We appreciate the Benton report, and thank you, John, for the presentation. Thank you, CTF and California Forward, for having us. Local leadership is key. Every jurisdiction is facing different priorities, navigating natural disaster impacts, and struggling with dwindling staff and budget resources. We have had a very long road to realign priorities from being in a constant reactionary state to fostering future planning. Broadband can assist with many of these challenges and empower local governments to control the conversation in pursuit of solutions to meet the needs of their community's priorities. As an example, e-government is a real solution that can lift the burden of dwindling staff and financial resources that currently present challenges to rural health and remote learning. The current pandemic has highlighted the fact that our region is being further and further left behind regarding the opportunities and resources to advance our region to our engagement in a global economy. We have been building consensus to foster conversations with our partners as part of the solution, while offering our own assets to assist with a multi-benefit solution that meets our requirement of the triple bottom line. We highlight our community anchor institutions as the nexus to achieving success in tackling many of the challenges we face in distance government, equitable and available healthcare, reliable emergency management, and educational opportunities to give our students equality in a demanding global economy. While our region has innovation and inroads to activities to participate in global economies, we do not have the infrastructure to foster their growth. We acknowledge and strive to resolve low adoption rates throughout our region because we know the value of success in this area. However, the lack of access and affordability due to limited competition changes the conversation. We continue to struggle with funding models and work with our local, state, and federal elected officials to change the definitions so we can be competitive. Over the past 2 years, we have leveraged the proven need for more than the traditional funding levels and have successful projects that are over at 100% funding. Our success grows in policy and master broadband plan adoption throughout our region. We have engaged in government and provider listening sessions with a focus on specific local solutions. We have assisted in formulating alternative solutions with local utilities, presenting open network design and undergrounding for hardening and public safety. Please join us December 3rd from 12:30 to 2:30 for the Ensuring Broadband for All California Economic Summit, where we will have an update of the alternative approach the town of Paradise is putting into action. So John, what else can we be doing in aligning state and federal funding opportunities to address the most rural areas with sparse populations where the cost per household is well beyond current perceived projections?
Well, listen, Jason, it sounds like you're doing everything, and it sounds terrific. And it's great that you're pulling people together in your conference next month. The rural issue is one where I think we can expect congressional action next year, because it's not first of all, it's very obvious. There's just like is no network. It's not debatable, and it has a broad constituency, and the constituency tends to be bipartisan, right? But there are problems. The overbuilding issue is one problem, and that needs to be dealt with. A second issue that comes up in some of these programs is just the complexity of applying for federal help where it's available. There's one federal application that's something like 250 pages long, and we've talked to people at the state of local level who say they don't participate because, gosh, it's too complicated. Thirdly, there's the question of who qualifies. Some federal programs welcome state and local government partners, others don't. But as we've looked around it, it's local governments, your point about local leadership, that's often fundamental in pulling together a community, in talking to providers and understanding the art of the possible. And so to preclude them from being part of the grant process or getting funds, that's not helpful. And then a final point. And this is a little bit what I said before. One could sit in Washington, D.C. and look at maps, particularly if we ever had good maps, which we don't have right now, and say, okay, I can just tell you how to allocate these networks. But again, we've heard from people at the state level and from rural places that the federal programs need to take into account the kinds of providers in various places. States have started to do that, right? In 2019, a number of states really opened the door, for example, for rural electric co-ops, which can be very important in rural deployment. But we need more understanding of how efforts work at the local level. This is part of the agenda that I hope will be adopted in the next year to recognize and support local leadership, the kinds of things you're describing, Jason, which sound terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so we're going to jump into some of the questions that we have from the audience. And I'm going to combine some questions here. And actually, I'm going to start out with a little bit of a techie one. We've been talking a little bit about, or a lot about, and the report is really focused on the need for broadband to empower participation in the economy and in society. But there are questions from Carl Nettleton and Lee who are asking about different technologies, 5G deployment, satellite technologies, and other types of technologies. And so how should we think about the combination of technologies in order to meet people's needs, perhaps especially in rural areas? And then as a follow-up from Barbara O'Connor, do we need a statewide or federal sort of network reliability council to connect these disparate technologies and really provide us a much better sense of where there is service for folks throughout the state?
Yeah. Well, it's great to get a question from Barbara, who's been such a leader in this area, who is such a leader in this area. I do think whether it's a network reliability council or just federal efforts, you know, there was a data mapping bill passed. It needs to be funded. It's long past time for us to understand who has what kind of technologies. That's just got to get done, and it's got to get done fast. I do think it's useful at the federal level for people to be thinking about not just the nature of the technology, but the cost of the service to individuals, right? That's how we assess whether people can actually use technology. We don't just ask, is there a car dealership in a neighborhood? We ask, well, what is it selling? What can people use? What's effective in the community? We need transparent information on the pricing of broadband, which we don't have, to be able to really assess not just the presence, but the adequacy of networks in a particular area. Now, the first part of your question rightly asks about technology. The way I think about it, I divide it into two pieces. One is, if the federal government is spending a lot of money what kind of technology should it spend on? Well, it ought to, I've used these words again and again, scalable, future-proof. What do I mean by that? I mean networks that can meet expected future demand, not just on upload and download speeds, but on latency, which is a problem with high Earth orbiting satellites, and also what is the capacity, data capacity, right? Sometimes people say, well, mobile networks are alternatives, but they have because of their wireless architecture, they limit data usage to 30 gigabytes or 50 gigabytes a month, way under what the average, for example, cable broadband user is. So if we're going to spend a lot of federal money, we ought to spend it on networks that are going to deliver the kind of performance people want. That's fiscally responsible. That's a good use of public dollars. But then secondly, let's come to the world of competition. The more the merrier, right? Fixed wireless can be very helpful some places, where particularly in rural areas where fiber doesn't get all the way to a farm door. We have the prospect of new technologies, low Earth orbiting satellite, 5G, that can perhaps provide solutions somewhere. Now, we ought to welcome new technologies as a matter of competition. There will be places where they make a big difference. But we don't know the outcomes of these new technologies yet. And so we shouldn't stop our pursuit of broadband deployment and competition to wait for the technologies. The problem is urgent, but we should surely open the door for them because they may make a difference. They may make things better, even where the federal government funds a network. If a new network comes in and provides alternative benefits, all the more that should happen.
Great. You touched on this just a little bit, but I want to put a finer point on it. We've been talking a ton about deployment,
yes,
but we haven't actually talked about cost.
Yes.
You know, a number of people are, you know, a part of the digital divide because they have access to internet, but they can't pay for it. And so whether a state program or a federal program, or how should we think about the cost of high-speed broadband and bridging the divide that way, from David Capelli and Carla Mays?
So this is I mentioned, I think, in passing, that Mignon Clyburn, right, who's the former FCC commissioner, and I did an op-ed. It was in the Boston Globe over the summer, where we proposed that Congress create an affordable broadband credit. And here's the backdrop on this. There is a Lifeline program. It does provide connectivity. It has been expanded to broadband, but it's typically used by people for mobile service. And the program characteristics work best in mobile in some respects. To date, there has not been a recognition that it's essential for low-income people to have broadband to their home, the kind of broadband connection that, for example, a cable system provides, that a household can use, not a single person on a single device. So what Mignon and I suggested was that it's time for Congress to come up with that. Now, we don't know exactly what the budget to that should be or how much it will cost, because there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done about who should be eligible and what the cost of the different eligible groups by household would be. In the Benton report that just came out, we provide a set of different issues that need to be solved and that Congress should take on. But just let us give you one sense. And this has been talked about in terms of some emergency legislation. Roughly speaking, for $50 a month, at least in urban areas, people can get usable broadband. It's not 1 gigabit symmetrical typically, if ever, but it's usable for a household with multiple people engaged in interactive activities. So we said maybe that's a starting point, $50 a month. We don't, of course, want to pay for services that people will get for less cost now, and there are low-income programs that some of the incumbents provide, and very helpfully so. But we just think the time has come to get out of the stovepipe thinking of the past universal service funds and think about what people need and just recognize that affordable broadband is not just for the benefit of the people who are low income who get it, but end up benefiting all of society when they can participate more effectively. Does that help, Micah? Does that give you a sense of this?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I want to, I have a question from a fellow panelist, Julie Meyer-Wright, and this really speaks to the, you know, we're talking in some cases about the federal or state governments as a funder for these efforts, but let's step back from that and think a little bit about, is there more that the federal government can do to either incentivize private providers to do rapid deployment, or penalize them if we in fact have, you know, this question words as lousy service, right? So are there, you know, is there a different and more perhaps aggressive regulatory structure, but also incentives as well as penalties in order to get the private market working better here?
Well, let me give you just one. We've all seen food labels, right? That was a federal mandate. They're very helpful. A lot of people rely on them, right? You can tell how many calories or what's in a food product, because it allows consumers to be effective in making choices. When I was at the Federal Communications Commission, as part of the net neutrality order in 2015, we created a broadband label. It's just like a broadband nutritional label that would tell consumers what they're getting and what they're paying for. This commission repealed that. That's a very simple step. Just empower consumers to be able to make meaningful judgments about the nature of the broadband that they're paying for. That ought to be the first thing that happens, putting that kind of label back into place, because, and we're working on a paper on this, the fact is it's very difficult to understand what kinds of prices incumbent providers are offering to consumers. It's very difficult. And that makes it hard for consumers. It makes it hard for consumers to choose. It makes it hard for governments or academics to analyze. So we got to get price transparency. And I mean that to include service, the nature of service, for example, latency, what we've talked about before. That needs to be done. What can we do to promote innovation? Well, I think we need to think about the federal government as not just for this purpose, the FCC, NTIA, and the Ag Department. That's where these kinds of broadband programs tend to be used, tend to be administered. What else does the federal government do? It buys things, and it can think about where it's buying broadband and how that broadband, those broadband connections can be used. There's one effort in rural Virginia, for example, that wasn't planned this way, but it worked off of the fact that a NASA facility needed fiber run to it, and then it figured out a way to take advantage of that fiber for the benefit of local communities. The federal government should use procurement activities to try to expressly think about the spread of broadband. Just think of postal offices, for example, how many there are, how they need to be connected, and how often they're in rural America. Secondly, anything the federal government does ought to be informed by allowing broadband to proceed. I talked before about transportation and housing. And that would also incentivize investment. And then, you know, local governments should look themselves at questions of rights of ways, poles attachments, to the extent they can influence that, but their own assets, state and local assets, and how they can be used to incentivize further deployment. It's a barrier to entry question. How can governments lower the costs of entering into broadband in order to get more people to do it? It's not that hard as a matter of conceptualization. It's a lot of work to get done in practice, but I think it's got to get taken on.
Great. Just a quick federal policy question for our state audience. Do we know when Biden will have an opportunity to appoint new FCC commissioners and how many?
Well, we don't. It's an interesting question. There are 5 FCC commissioners. No more than 3 can be of one party. There is a vacancy that the lame duck Congress may take up for a Republican seat, or what has been a Republican seat. A candidate who has come to mind largely around this so-called Section 230 issue and an executive order issued by the White House. So we don't know if that candidate will be confirmed in the lame duck. Then there's the question of the makeup of the commission. Historically, if one is a chair of the commission, one steps aside when a new president of the other party comes in. If that's true, then Chairman Pai, if that practice is followed, Chairman Pai would step down before the inauguration. And there would be either a 3 or 4 person commission, depending on whether this other nominee is confirmed. Let's say he is. Then we would have a 2-2 commission, and the president could appoint a 5th commissioner, could appoint that person to be the next chair, or could select presumably one of the 2 Democrats now serving as the chair. Okay, so now we've gotten into the politics of the United States Senate. We don't know how the Georgia races are going to come out. And we don't know if there is a Republican Senate, how quickly it will move on appointees. It can take a while. I came in and worked for Tom Wheeler, right? Who was in the 2nd Obama term. He was nominated, I think, in the spring, and I believe, I may be wrong, that he was actually confirmed in late October or early November. So we could be in for some period of time, potentially where there's a 2-2 commission. That might limit activity, but I would expect that the time would come when there would be, as is normal, a 3-2 Democratic commission with people who are looking to be able to expand broadband access.
Great, thanks. So this is a little bit of a, these Q&A periods can be a little bit of stump the speaker. And
not hard in this
remind,
case.
and so far, thank you so much. You've been doing an amazing job. But also just want to remind the other panelists, if you want to jump in and answer the questions,
Yes.
you can help John out. Because I'm actually going to go back to a pretty technical question, but I wanted to hit it because there was a lot of talk earlier on, especially about anchor institutions. And so I have a question from Philip Neufeld about school districts and providing internet access more broadly. So many of the school districts are looking to solve for connecting students, especially in disadvantaged neighborhoods, by using private LTE or mmWave networks. But districts are typically looking to use their existing LAN, local and wide area networks and internet backhaul, rather than this resource to pay for additional internet access. But we have some folks, including the California Department of Education, that are concerned about this use of internet access to support students beyond the school campus. So it sounds like there's some ambiguity. And so the question is whether the FCC or California organizations like CETF will help step into this ambiguity and reduce the concern about school districts' efforts to support their students. And so I guess this is really kind of a classic state and federal, partnership issue where it might be helpful to for the school districts to have this direction of how to provide access to the students in these disadvantaged communities.
Yeah. And look, I see John Windhausen is still with us. I can see from the chat. Maybe just for the sake of getting a really good answer, we should let John take this first. And then I do want to add something about an emergency petition that's now pending. But John, do you want to take this one or somebody else first?
It looks like we've got Sunny as well. I don't know if you want to address this either.
I do want to address it, but let's go to John and then I can comment.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me a chance to answer this question. I'm sure John Sallet could have done a great job with this, but I'll step in to give him a break. So there is some, I guess on the legal side, there is some ambiguity in the law about whether schools can use E-rate built networks to extend service to the home and to students at home. The current FCC, Chairman Pai, takes the position that the statute does not allow them to do that, and that such extensions to the home are not permitted under the statute. I disagree with that. I think Section 254, that footnote I helped to draft when I was on Capitol Hill, I think it actually does provide some flexibility to the FCC because, for several reasons, but the main reason in my mind is that the whole Section 254 creates the Universal Service Fund, and it sets out the principles of universal service, and it specifically says to take a progressive and ongoing interpretation of what is required for universal service. And it's supposed to upgrade the definition of universal service over time to reflect new technologies. Well, that gives the FCC the flexibility to identify what services it should and shouldn't be able to fund. Furthermore, the Section 254 talks about the classrooms. Well, today the classrooms are effectively taking place in students' homes, and they're convening over the school network. So as long as they're tapping into the school-built network from home, I think there's a strong argument E-rate funds can and should be used to fund that purpose. However, even if you don't accept my legal argument, there is a sort of an in-between argument that says that you should be able to extend service from school to the home as long as you cost allocate out the additional costs of doing so. And this is actually recognized in the FCC's rules today. There is a cost allocation process that it's in the rules that allows you to say, okay, this portion of the cost will be funded by E-rate. This incremental portion of additional costs will fund those on our own, but it's not a barrier to doing that extension. It's actually a way for you to do it so at minimal cost. Shelby has been considering filing a petition with the FCC on this point to get clarity. I know that Colorado and Nevada and a few other states have submitted petitions making this request. We actually made this request from the FCC back in March, but the FCC didn't act on it. Now we're thinking of filing this petition on January 21st, after the inauguration, when it's very likely that current Commissioner Rosenworcel, a Democrat, will be elevated to be chair, at least interim chair, possibly permanent chair. But we're going to have a more friendly FCC at that point, and Jessica Rosenworcel has been a strong advocate of allowing E-rate funds to be used for this purpose. So we think there's a good chance that we'll be able to make some progress on this score. Having said that, I was quite interested in the questioner's note about the California Department of Education creating some concern about that. I'd love to hear more about what that concern is, because I don't understand that, and that could help inform our federal analysis.
Actually, so if I might comment, Micah, and thank you, John, and thank you, Jonathan. Certainly, Jonathan and John are far more expert with the Federal Communications Commission law and the regulations. I might add that we're largely talking about the 1996 Telecom Act that actually is pretty anachronistic for today's internet, and that we actually need a new congressional authority, as Congressmember Clyburn has put forward. Having said that, I do expect that the thrust of the question from the California Department of Education, knowing what Superintendent Thurman, his team, Mary Nicely, et cetera, have done, is to actually talk about schools, school districts, what we call local education agencies. We also include in that community colleges, county office of education, to become eligible applicants for, ultimately, we hope, federal dollars, but certainly in California,
those of us who are the regional consortia and CETF are supporting principles for reforming and extending funding of the California Advanced Services Fund that would allow explicitly all local governments, tribal governments, and any public agency, including school districts, and joint exercise of powers agencies to apply for our state funding that could be used to leverage federal funding. So it's in the interest of, John, as you would say, it shall be to and through an anchor institution, a school, to be able to jump off of any of those networks for last mile construction, but also to recognize, in the interest of reforming, E-rate, so that that's explicitly possible to reach all of the students through E-rate, to have our state funding being prepared to match federal dollars by authorizing education entities of all kinds to be applicants of for our state funding, regardless of the spectrum that they're using. We do hope that the education spectrum is still made available to education institutions. And we've got very good examples in Imperial and Kings County in California where this has been used effectively. But I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that we are hoping to get legislation through the California legislature soon. We think Assemblymember Aguirre Correa again will introduce legislation that gives significant funding and authorizes as applicants local school districts, county offices of education, community colleges to be able to apply for such infrastructure dollars.
Thanks, Sunny. Thanks, John. So 2+ hours in, we did do one extraordinarily deep in the weeds technical question. So thanks for that. I don't know, John, if there's anything in particular you wanted to add to that. And if not, I just want to hit a couple of other sort of, lightning round questions after that, and then pass it over to Sunny to wrap things up for us.
I just want to say what I always say on issues that involve schools and libraries. I agree with John Windhausen.
All right. Two more questions. And actually, Trish, do you want to ask your question about the eligibility for federal funding given the rural definitions?
Yes, thank you so much, Micah. We in our region, because our rural areas are close to metropolitan statistical areas, we are locked out of a lot of the eligibility for funding, especially for USDA and sometimes FCC funding. So we've had the chairman out. He's agreed that our it looks rural and is rural. So do you think that in the new deliberations, there'll be an opportunity to change the definitions for rural to be really on what rural is and not, kind of a fake definition in a way?
Yeah, I do think there will be. I mean, there's been writing about this. Chris Ali, who's a professor at the University of Virginia and who works with Benton, has a book that's coming out next year about the issues around rural broadband, and he specifically highlights the problem of competing and incomplete definitions. And I think as we move towards a more comprehensive approach, that will open the door for exactly this kind of reconsideration.
Great, thank you. Well, we'd love to be
Great.
in the conversation. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Trish. So one more question, and then I'll turn it over to Sunny. And this from Carl Nettleton, but it kind of boils down to, when will it be infrastructure week? We were promised for the past 4 years that we would, get proposals around tremendous infrastructure investments. We got other things. But with the sort of understanding of how important broadband infrastructure is there actually hope? I mean, this moment is whatever it is, but if we get back to something approaching normalcy, which God willing we will, and President-elect Biden begins to work with what very well may be a Republican Senate, is there an opportunity to have bipartisan cooperation on infrastructure investments in broadband in the coming years?
There absolutely should be, right? I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not sure I would have foreseen a lot that's happened if I had had one. But gosh, all the elements are there. In other words, the key to bipartisan solutions are programs that help the people who both sides want to help. And because broadband is about every American, and because there are different challenges, the critical question is, will people accept that they should support solutions that deal with other communities than the ones they may represent? But the prospect here, I think, is good. I tend to be an optimist, right? I think it's good because I think the COVID crisis has brought home, in a literal sense, the need for broadband. And I understand there's some people on one side or some people on the other who take issue with different solutions. But if we've ever been set up for a broadband solution, this is the time. And if there's ever a time for infrastructure, it's coming out of economic dislocation. And we have had, and we are having, big economic dislocation. So this may depend on factors that we can't engineer into an analysis as we stand here today, but the circumstances are right. And if the voices are heard, it will make more likely that those circumstances lead to progress.
Great. Well, John, I just really want to appreciate for your hanging with the Stump the Speaker questions, for your tremendous presentation that, you know, blended just extraordinarily deep knowledge of the technical aspects of broadband, but really within the frame of the necessity of this for economic inclusion, for business vitality, for everything that we need to deal with the pandemic, to deal with the economic crisis, to deal with the unfortunately spiraling inequality in our society. So really appreciate the partnership with the Benton Institute. Really encourage everybody to read the report. Just 40 pages. There are longer reports out there, but we're glad to have gotten that summary today. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors for this event. And to bring us home, I'm going to turn it over to Sunny Wright McPeak. Sunny is the president and CEO of the California Emerging Technology Fund, and just you know, what you've seen today. I mean, we're just getting to Sunny now, but a lot of folks that have been working with her on these issues for quite a long period of time. She's been a champion for our work through the California Economic Summit and still leading our Broadband for All work group. So we deeply appreciate all of your support, all of your partnership, and you're helping to bring this together today. So I will now turn it over to you to close us out. Thank you so much, Sunny.
Thank you, Micah, for being just superb in managing all of this. And thank you to the entire California Forward team, to Susan Levenberg, to Lauren Giglisi, to Hania Palacios, who really did all of this in the middle of you actually preparing for the California Economic Summit that will be December 3rd and 4th. And to the Benton Institute, to you, Jonathan Sallet, and to Adrian Furness for joining us. We really appreciate the opportunity to get personally briefed by you on your report. The report that you just released is only 40 pages. I also would suggest that the 100+ pages from the 2019 report provides even additional context for your recommendations. Your first point in the 2020 report is to, I think I might have just had a problem here. Your first point, Jonathan, is around digital equity. And I just want to say that trying to relate broadband, even broadband deployment and adoption to people is so important that we've taken that note of digital equity and embraced the concept of a digital equity bill of rights. Our commissioner of the PUC, Martha Guzman-Aceves, sort of raised this issue before the California Broadband Council, and we at CETF have taken that idea and run with it. You can find our digital equity bill of rights on the CETF website. But in addition to that, as we've looked at the opportunity now presented to us in California with Governor Newsom issuing the executive order for broadband for all and the preparation of a broadband action plan under the aegis of the California Broadband Council Director Amy Tong, Stephanie Tom and her team actually pulling this all together. We have begun the work so that we're positioned now with this new day in Washington, D.C. with the next administration, that your report makes so possible a roadmap to work with the Biden administration in making a significant difference for all of the residents of this country, and particularly for the 40 million residents in California. When Julie Meyer Wright asked if the California Emerging Technology Fund could contribute to the Council on Competitiveness, and she was the one who saw there was such this essential underpinning of high-speed internet infrastructure for all competitiveness, for all sectors. We accepted the invitation, and then we pointed out 5 major things that the council could focus on that is complemented by the Benton Institute, beginning by setting goals that we absolutely have to close the digital divide in this country, and we need to have metrics that go with those. We also have to have a significant investment. We calculated 100 billion. Today, that number has actually come through. It's close to what Congressmember Clyburn has also said. So we put down the marker, $100 billion from the federal government that we need. We also need to be able to leverage that with state dollars, partner with state and regions. We need a much more performance-based regulatory regime. And at the FCC, we actually need to have Lifeline that works for all of the residents and all states in this nation as a backdrop and safety net for voluntary affordable offers from the internet service providers. We in California, with the action plan that Amy and Stephanie will submit to the governor by the end of December of this year, should put us in the position to now be a front line partner to the federal government. That's what we're about today, is this whole notion of digital equity, in fact, a quest for digital equity. So we are going to put down the marker for what we in California need to invest, which is about $7 billion to be a partner to the federal government. And in that regards, I just want to say thank you to all of the regional consortia who have joined in this effort to frame a workable bill for the California Advanced Services Fund, working with CENIC to outline also the parameters for a general obligation bond that we should consider taking to the voters of California in a couple of years when that's possible. And then lastly, I hope that we can also invite you in this quest for digital equity to visit our website to hear a conversation from former FCC commissioners Rochelle Chong and Mignon Clyburn. They recorded a couple of weeks ago before we knew the outcome of the election. These are 2 commissioners who've had vision, who've been pioneers and who've led the way for not only those of us in California, but also I think the nation. And so I want to close out again, thanking you, California Forward, for hosting. All of you who are the digital champions who listened today, take heart, because digital equity is within our grasp. Thank you for joining us.